Welcome to Theology, Imagination and the Arts with me, your host, Daniel Côté Davis. Today's guest is Fr Aidan Nichols, a Dominican priest who is the author of The Realm, an unfashionable essay on the conversion of England, which calls for the recovery of a distinct Catholic identity and a confident faith which seeks to provide a common purpose for the realm of England, rather than being indifferent or diluted into the wider secular culture. Fr Aidan, welcome. We are really delighted you can join us today.
Thank you.
As the title of your book shows, The Realm is an essay on or for the conversion of England, specifically on England, not on Scotland or Wales. Why have you chosen to write your book in this way and with this specific focus?
Well, I'm English. One of the earliest memories I have is my father telling me that if one wasn't English, then the only thing one could be was French. So definitely not Irish or Welsh or even Scottish, though I'm a quarter Scottish. But when I became a Roman Catholic, which was during the Second Vatican Council, and though I entered into a religious culture then that was essentially pre-conciliar in its content, I felt a need later to marry my English identity to the form of Christianity that I'd adopted, in leaving behind, a kind of Wordsworthian, romantic, nature-oriented paganism, and then having a short interlude of Anglo-Catholicism, rather at a distance, because there was no Anglo-Catholic parish near where I lived, but then finally opting to be instructed, this is as a teenager, as a Roman Catholic. The two sides of what my father had told me and what I had myself chosen to do had to be brought together in some way, hence the book.
So it's really bringing all that home together for you in the main thesis of your book, which is that Catholicism and a Catholic society, which does not actually imply the individual confession of a Catholic faith of all its inhabitants, is the best way to restore England to the full flourishing of civilization. That's how I understand your thesis. As Catholicism, in your view, built our nation. So why is Catholicism, in your view, both the foundation and true destiny of the English people, as I think you argue?
Well, foundation, I do argue. True destiny, I think, is possibly your gloss on what I wrote. So foundation, well, that's simply a historical claim, clearly, that the English nation came to be as a consequence of the manner of the conversion of the Germanic arrivals to what had previously been a Roman British society that was pagan in part and also Christian in part already, such that you can't envisage the history of England except from the starting point of the conversion. And I would see that mirrored in a small way in the fact that the fairly standard translation of Bede's ecclesiastical history was entitled at one point in the Penguin production of it, History of the English Church and People. And that's because it's almost impossible to separate in Bede the story of the evangelization of the island from the story of its political development. And that would then point ahead to the way in which, under the Anglo-Danish kings and the last Anglo-Saxon kings, the country did in fact become a single realm under a single crown.
Sure, and so this was a unifying element in Catholic Christianity between the Celtic, Latin and Germanic cultures, which led to this emergence, you say, of English history itself. And Christianity largely influenced the legal dimension that emerged. The law itself incorporates something of a religious argument. and could, as I understand you suggest, promote the common good, an integral vision of the common good. So maybe you could open up for us somehow this foundational political narrative, which leads to maybe some of your conclusions about the common good.
Well, what I suggested was that what we find in the course of the English Middle Ages is what I think are called at one point an implicit social covenant, which itself builds on the baptismal covenant, which precedes it in the moment of the conversion. So that the social covenant in question involves the way in which the law, which at a certain point simply considered as a body of writing, was often bound up with either the Latin Bible or with an ecclesiastical source. I mention in the book the homilies of Archbishop Wulfstan, for instance. So the law, the king, and then the institutions that eventually became Parliament are fused into a unity of duties and responsibilities, as well as liberties and rights, that take their cue from Christianity and in the context of the common law, notably, form the basis of a Christian humanism for the life of society. So we might, for instance, want to contrast that with a view of law which is primarily interested in the generation of recognition of individual rights, rights that appear in the contemporary period to be developing in all kinds of strange directions that take us very far from the notion of what the reasonable man would take to be properly human as the common law tradition of medieval and early modern England understands it. I wonder if I could just, though, flash back to one or two elements in your earlier questions, as I didn't explain to you why I have to dissent from your reading of the book, whereby you argue that I present Catholic Christianity as the appropriate destiny of the English people. And I have a reservation about that because I'm not entirely sure what the world situation will look like when the parousia happens. Robert Hugh Benson, the Edwardian priest-novelist, provided two visions, one utopian, one dystopian, of that final condition of things. The Lord of the World presents us with a church that's minimally existing when the Antichrist comes to power. That's the dystopia. The utopian version, The Dawn of All, presents a scheme where the church has effectively converted the world and is receiving the final submission of, I think, the Chinese emperor the moment that the novel begins. So, but that also flags up something which might have been useful if I'd said in relation to your first question when you asked about how I came to write the book at all, or to frame it in the way I did. And that's because you emphasized my choice of the conversion of England,
yeah, that's right,
rather than my choice of the theme of conversion, more generally. And the reason why I wanted to write about the conversion of England and not, for example, about the way in which, through corporal works of mercy, the Catholic Church in England could help to plug gaps in the welfare state, which could have been an approach to what is the relevance of Catholicism for contemporary English society, was that I noted the very striking contrast between the emphasis on the mission to convert England, which fell on all practicing Catholics, during the period when I was instructed, which was effectively a hangover from the pre-conciliar mentality of English Catholicism. Contrast between that and the deafening silence on that topic of conversion, which followed subsequently. It's interesting to speculate on the reasons for that. One important reason, I think, would be the rise of ecumenism and ecumenical sensitivity, and that then expanded later into concern with interreligious dialogue, which therefore provided another possible source of de-emphasis for the conversion idea. So if you go all the way with prioritizing ecumenism and interreligious dialogue, both very important areas, but if you essentially so prioritize them that they are the exclusive constituents of church policy towards what is beyond the visible frontiers of the church, you have effectively abandoned the Great Commission given by Jesus Christ at the end of the Gospel of St. Matthew, to go and preach to all nations, and moreover, you have succumbed to a kind of unconditional acceptance of pluralism in such a way that I argue in the book, I think, if not elsewhere, that an obstacle is presented to the working of the grace of baptism and confirmation. That's to say that if the evangelizing mission which is given to each initiated Christian, embryonically in baptism, but more fully with the gifts of the Holy Spirit in confirmation, which is very much a sacrament for taking on full responsibilities, including for mission, of the life begun in baptism. If you remove from people, by the way you present the church's task, any sense of urgency or even importance about the conversion of their co-nationals or their fellow citizens, you actually are creating what the scholastics called an obex. That's to say, an obstacle to the outworking of baptismal and chrismational grace, the grace of confirmation, because you are frustrating at birth, so to speak, the child that should be born from those sacraments. So that might be a useful add-on to this conversation.
Yeah, it's fascinating because conversion can seem like something almost threatening in a way that might actually stop the workings of the Holy Spirit in a way that might be maybe a bit more surprising and unexpected, perhaps. But if you set out very intentionally, I'm going to make converts, there could be strengths and weaknesses maybe in the approach or the schema, something like that, perhaps?
Well, I think it has to be the subterranean concern, or it's not possible to say that we are fulfilling that Great Commission at the end of St. Matthew's Gospel. That doesn't mean to say that that crude and unreflective methods of evangelization are ever appropriate. It doesn't mean to say that it's not necessary to think hard about what might be involved in bringing the membership of another church tradition into full communion with the Catholic Church. We've had an example of that, of course, in the pontificate of Pope Benedict XVI with the creation of the Ordinariate of Our Lady of Walsingham for former Anglicans. Thought has also been given in the past, and to some extent the present, about what might be involved in the survival of aspects of Indian philosophy and intellectual and spiritual culture in the context of baptism, and there have to be analogues thought through of that Anglican and that Hindu example for other Christian bodies and for other world religions, so that it's not a question of obliterating everything in the patrimonies of other Christians or in the cultural, which would include spiritual wealth of followers of other religions, but it's a question of seeing how much of this can be brought through into Catholic Christianity in its fullness, rather in the way in which in ancient Britain elements of Celtic and Germanic paganism were brought into the vocabulary, as it were, ritual and verbal vocabulary of an artistic vocabulary of Christianized early English.
Thank you. No, that's really helpful, and I'm grateful for that, because I've learnt a lot about what you meant by conversion just through this conversation. That's really helpful, because qualifying that does a lot to explain, I think, why the book could be very effective, because it might be misread as maybe perhaps something that could be seen as polemical somehow, but it isn't. The way you've clarified that is that conversion is something that everybody more broadly is trying to do, and would not be, as you said, obliterating anything that is already good. So I'm really grateful for that clarification. So your work has resonated, I think, written a long time before the coronation of King Charles III, but when that happened, we saw in public a Catholic rite, essentially, in the liturgical form, and this monarchical coronation rite you actually go in detail to describe in the book. So therefore you see, as you stated, a kind of authority that passes from the church into the parliamentary spheres, as I understand. So I would like to ask you why the English monarch, in your view, is inexorable to the future of a Catholic England, and how does the monarchy influence the political vision of the nation, in your view?
Well, when I think about these matters, theopolitically, as they say nowadays, I start from the principle that in the world after the Ascension, the reign of Christ the King over the political order, as over all other orders and dimensions that the New Testament might refer to under the rubric of principalities and powers, is something which is already achieved at one level, but needing to be finally fulfilled at another. So I start from the starting point then, not of belief in a civil order that after the Paschal mystery and the victory of Christ, which was gained there over all ungodly powers, start from the principle that the civil order after the Ascension cannot be a neutral civil order. It must be a civil order that is brought in all empirical reality under the sway of Christ the King, in a way that reflects, therefore, the underlying theological reality that Christ is the King of society. Now, if you begin from that principle, then when you're thinking about organizing the magistracy of a society, when you're thinking about organizing how its polity is going to be arranged and structured, then kingship or monarchy strikes you as the most obviously iconic form of such polity there can be, because there's clearly an exact correlation between the biblical revealed symbol of the kingship of God in Jesus Christ, and Christ the King, on the one hand, and this form of civil sovereignty on the other. And that means then that that form of civil sovereignty can be used to do several things that arise from this isomorphism between the figure of the human king, the purely human king, and the divine human king, Jesus Christ. So one obvious one is that the human king who intends the society over which he presides to be a mirror of the kingdom of God as it's come to be with the exaltation of Jesus Christ, that human king can hope to communicate, embody, defend the various virtues that are characteristic of the reign of God in Jesus Christ. And they're symbolized in the coronation ritual by the swords of justice and mercy that are carried before the candidate for crowning. Another important symbolic valency to the way in which the king can mirror the kingship of Christ is to do with the way in which a Christian monarchy can indicate the desirable limits of all human power vis-a-vis divine authority. That is one of the things that's signified when the king is stripped in the course of the coronation ceremony of his outer garments, and they're replaced by the colobion, the alb, which is the garment that was given to the naked candidates for baptism as they came out of the font. And it's a symbol then of humility and simplicity. And then the dalmatic, which is put on the king at his robing, which is a symbol of service. And that gives a very powerful indicator at the symbolic level of the way in which civil authority must always be concerned to be the servant of the common good of the people and not the exploiter of that people. So those would be two ways in which the symbolism of kingship and coronation mirror the proper order between civil society and the divine plan. Now, to what extent that is realized in the constitutional monarchy of the United Kingdom in 2025 as memories of the coronation ceremony, which not everybody would have watched with the right kind of antennae anyway, is of course a moot point. But I would see the monarch as ideally having the duty of seeking to, first of all, defend the church, which carries the message of the kingship of Christ, which the king is to reflect. So to defend the church, to embody, or if through human frailty he fails to fully embody, at least to encourage and promote by his public discourse the virtues that I've mentioned, which are virtues integral to the life of the kingdom. To give an example of the kind that I think even Republicans would agree Queen Elizabeth II gave of a totally committed, as they say, lifelong service to the duties of state and the duties of her role. All of that would be very desirable, and if you have the case of an heir to the throne, let us say, who is not able to internalize the Christian belief system as an individual, it's still possible for him, or conceivably her, to adopt the public persona where this range of roles, rules, and values is concentrated. one would like to see a situation where, because of a massive change in the culture of the whole country, so in the educational system, in the media, in attitudes to recreation, entertainment, in the arts, one would like to see a situation where a sweeping change in the culture of the whole country made it possible for the monarch to exercise, with the consent of public opinion, a right of veto in the legislative process over imprudent decisions of a parliamentary assembly that conflict with the natural law and with Christian revelation at its most fundamental. I'm thinking, for example, of the law of abortion or of euthanasia, but that does require a considerable change in the whole tenor of public life and personal conviction.
And do you see this whole landscape still being impacted by the Protestant Reformation, this interrelationship of the monarchy with the English people today? And do you see the potential future of a return of the monarchy to the Catholic faith, and how could that be achieved within your vision of a deeper unity with Reformed Christians and basically not being a cultural obliteration, let's say, of everything that is good?
Well, the Protestant Reformation in England was very much a top-down Reformation, which was driven by the Tudor monarchy, and actually, in that regard, it could build upon a genuine memory of a feature of the ancient English Church, because in the Anglo-Saxon period, the role of kings in the calling of synods mirrored the way in which the early Christian emperors had a crucial role in the calling of general councils, and was in that respect a kind of suitable aftermath to the fashion in which the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons was essentially teamwork between bishops and kings. So from one point of view, the circumstances of the English Reformation fit perfectly well with my sort of overall view of the English polity. But of course, it is the case that there was a considerable rupture in various regards with the Church of the pre-Reformation era. Professor Eamon Duffy, in a famous book, The Stripping of the Altars, which has just come out in recently, I think, in a new revised edition, has somewhat undermined the Anglican case for the necessity of those ruptures by showing how vigorous and vibrant English Christian religious life was in the decades immediately preceding the Reformation. There remain, of course, issues of pure theology which have to be adjudicated. There is, as you know, a strong, although of latter decades not quite so strong, element in the Anglican Church which is fully aligned with Roman Catholicism in matters of Christian doctrine. I've just been preaching a retreat at the Anglican Shrine in Walsingham, which is one of the great strongholds of Anglo-Papalism in the Catholic movement in the Church of England. And there it's absolutely plain that there is no disparity between the material I've been giving the attendees of this retreat and the expectations they have of what counts as suitable doctrine to hear in church. At least that's my impression from talking to the recipients or victims. But then within the Church of England, you have those other streams which we would call liberal or latitudinarian in one case, and then evangelical or magisterially Protestant in another. When you move over to you mentioned the Reform, when you move over to the Calvinist wing of the Church of England, which has undergone a certain revival in recent years, even in the form of neo-Calvinist theological reading, or perhaps writing as well as a more general strengthening of the evangelical movement, you reach a point where people have essentially a view of the church as an invisible reality, which only comes to be empirically as individuals are struck by the Word of God and come together as a gathered church to seek to correspond to the invisible church, which is the abiding and complete reality of what it is to be the church. So there you would that would be an occasion where polemics, to use your word, would be appropriate, because although it's true that wherever possible in evangelization we seek a seamless transition of continuity between whether it's elements of the Christian patrimony that are compatible with Catholicism, or whether it's elements of good paganism that can be brought into Christianity through the waters of baptism. Although that's the case, it's still the case also that there is a sword of judgment that hangs over the world, and there are often hard decisions that have to be made, which are not 1,000 shades of grey, but are black or white. And so there are times where polemical comes from a word for war or struggle. There are times when there has to be a battle, a spiritual and intellectual battle, in which one can't say all have won and all will take away prizes.
Okay, so you mentioned this Catholic element that crystallized perhaps accidentally in the Oxford movement. I don't know how you read that history, but it is in a way linked perhaps to the beginning of the personal ordinariate of Our Lady of Walsingham. How do you read that history? That's quite curious how all these things seem to be interlinked in some way.
Well, the High Church party, so-called, in the Church of England is something that emerges relatively early. It emerges towards the end of the reign of James I, and it has a very significant afterlife in the Restoration period, and then in the 18th century, contrary to what the impression that some people gained in the past, it by no means died out completely, and it even had a little renaissance at the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, which was then the last of a series of precedents for the emergence of Tractarianism, of the Oxford movement, as claiming the Catholic rights of the Church of England, despite mistakes in doctrinal theology made by the English reformers in the mid-16th century. The Oxford movement differed from that earlier High Church Anglicanism in that it had a much stricter view of what counts as ecclesial probity, or what counts as the minimum conditions for continuing authentic ecclesiological understanding of what the church is. And by emphasizing so strongly the apostolic succession of bishops and the requirement of episcopal ordination for any full sacramental life, which is, of course, something that brings it much closer to Roman Catholicism than any of the earlier incarnations of High Church Anglicanism. And what we're seeing in the case of the creation of the Ordinariate of Our Lady of Walsingham is an invitation to those Anglicans who look to the Oxford Fathers, so therefore to Keble and Pusey with the loss of Newman to Rome, who look to the Oxford Fathers to set the tone for their Christianity, to find the natural fulfillment of that Oxford movement in full communion with a Roman Church that is happy to recognize everything that is orthodox and liturgically healthful and devotionally sound in that Anglo-Catholic inheritance. It's only been taken up in a very extremely limited way. There are various reasons for that. One is I think the lack of knowledge and sympathy of Roman Catholics, not least in England, for classical Anglo-Catholicism. The two, after all, were in a way in competition as rivals for much of the period after 1845, the year of Newman's conversion. I'm hoping to address that in a book that I've got coming out later this year called After Newman, A Eulogy for Anglo-Catholics, 1845 to 1965. Another question would be, of course, the question of the churches in which they worship, because people are deeply attached to their parish churches, and they don't want to leave them except under the stress of the most extreme emergency, which is not the case at the present time. Whether the possibility of leasing, the temporary leasing of churches, was ever envisaged in the course of discussion of the formation of the Ordinariate, I have no idea. But it could be that a time will come when there is a further movement of Anglo-Catholics towards Rome, in which more imaginative possibilities might be explored of a loan of church buildings over a certain period of time, renewable and such like, which would enable people to stay not only with their clergy, but also with the spiritual homes that they have in particularly beloved buildings that often a century or a century and a half or whatever of devotion has enriched with artworks, with memorials to especially loved clergy or benefactors, what have you. Meanwhile, it's still possible, I think, for Anglo-Catholicism, which represents well over 400 parishes in the Church of England, if we're thinking of the classical Anglo-Catholics who are under bishops who maintain apostolic church order in its fullness. It's still possible for those Anglo-Catholics who are still relatively numerous, along with the English Roman Catholic Church, to cooperate in mission and evangelization in a variety of ways, in different media. And I think that would be a very desirable element in growing together.
Sure. And this home that you refer to quite endearingly as Albion throughout the book, you sort of label the journey of the English people under that name, as I understand. And it's a poetic or literary term, often used to refer to the island of Great Britain itself, and with a sort of ancient and historical context. So and is related to the cliffs of Dover, I believe, but perhaps you could open up what the term Albion means to you and why you've chosen to refer to England in this way at the heart of your book.
Right, well, perhaps it wasn't entirely fair to Scotland, which was also known as Alba at one point.
Okay.
I think my thinking about Albion is probably, I suppose, a reflection of William Blake's use of the term, and which, not being in any way an expert on Blake, I couldn't resolve this one, but possibly he, though it may have indeed, as you say, a background in reference to Britain in his usage, it's more concerned with England. At least I take that to be likely given the terminology of the great hymn that was created out of his text about Jerusalem and the legend of the bringing of the Grail, or the bringing at least of, or even of the Christ child, to England's green and pleasant land.
Did Bede think this happened? Did Bede not mention this? Or I wonder.
Not that I can recall.
No.
But the Grail legend has a very convoluted history, and I think it's much more an obsession of the High Middle Ages and the later Middle Ages, though Glastonbury has got a history that precedes that in terms of the British sources, Welsh sources. No, I was going to say that my idea of Albion, England as Albion, is a bit like C.S. Lewis or Charles Williams, the third Inkling, so-called, their idea of Britain as logos, if that's how one's pronounced that, Logres. Mm-hmm. So what you have in, well, the theological fantasy novel of C.S. Lewis that's most influenced by Charles Williams, that's Hideous Strength. There you have reference to that logos idea that there was at some point an unfallen Britain which has not completely disappeared and which can still be accessed through conduits of various kinds, because actually it is the predestined future of the island. So Albion forms the same kind of role in my at least heading a chapter with that title, which is that Albion represents what England has been at its best and what it could be at its better. So in that sense, it's a kind of transfiguration of the idea of England. I don't think I go into it in much detail, and maybe that's why you asked the question. And I think I use it chiefly in order to prepare the way for talking about the culture critics from both Anglo-Catholic and Roman Catholic backgrounds who, if you like, had at the back of their minds when they criticised the shape of contemporary England and English society, an Albion or a logos notion.
Which perhaps Walsingham is something of an Albion for this nation as well, because distilled here is the heart of civilization in some way, and just the home of Nazareth. Everything that is transcendent and beautiful is somehow present here. And I know of people who say when they come to Walsingham, it's like they'd entered into another dimension, like they'd entered into a dream or a vision of something that has always been and will always be. And the Slipper Chapel actually contains within itself philologically the idea of slipping into another kind of dimension of reality. So not just where you take your shoes off, but where you enter into really the real England, as it were. So I'm really moved by that, because your understanding of Albion there seems to resonate for me with what Walsingham has become for a lot of people, and perhaps is within our story as English people as well. So you did mention here, and I did want to turn to this, these critics of the civilization, and I believe the two ones that you found quite important were T.S. Eliot and J.R. Tolkien. And within your book, you're looking for an integral evangelization of society, and I was wondering why these two authors, in your view, resonated so deeply with this project.
Well, I think I talk about maybe half a dozen figures. I do give quite a lot of space to Eliot, but it's mainly Eliot not as a literary figure, but Eliot as a social commentator. Though it wouldn't do to ignore the contribution of Eliot as a literary figure in that context, because you could say that in his early poetry, so above all in The Wasteland, then he is describing the desert that emerges in modern society when the moral and imaginative bases of human living becomes so etiolated or so desiccated that that life is, well, he almost presents it as a living death, at least the life of London commuters crossing London Bridge. And then in his later poetry, so this is after his conversion to Anglo-Catholicism, as it happens, then in his later poetry, above all in the four quartets, he seeks to show what happens when one becomes aware of the way in which the eternal intersects with the temporal in the incarnation, and the realm, the wider realm that opens out for personal life and for life in common. And through, in particular, Little Gidding, one of the four quartets, he does seek to relate that breakthrough to the historic story of the English people, because Little Gidding was a place where, to a certain degree, it proved possible to recreate a version of Catholic life and even monastic Catholic life after the Reformation, and in a place that was also associated with the King Martyr, Charles I, who, it's plausible to suggest, died as much for the principle of episcopacy as for any specifically civil political principle. So Eliot, as a poet, should have a place in my pantheon, even though I mostly wrote about his social criticism. And in the case of Tolkien, well, there you have, of course, a writer who is not setting out to write social criticism at all, but who nevertheless, in telling the story of The Lord of the Rings, which in a way is a story of passion and resurrection, and is a story also of the strength of the humble, embodied in the person of the hobbit who carries the ring to its doom, is offering in that sub-created world, as he would say, which in its own way is a retelling of the Christian story, the story of the life of Christ, I mean, and his victory. But he does also offer a message about the ordering of society. He offers a message about kingship very strongly. There's a recent book by Christopher Scarfe, I think it is, which is specifically on the notion of kingship in Tolkien, but also in C.S. Lewis and Charles Williams. But he also offers an account of the importance of the agrarian order, which is something that was very dear to the distributivist critics of an over-industrialized England in the period around the First World War. And one can see that his basic social model is a combination of, you might say, hierarchy and the hierarchy of monarchy and the egalitarianism of a republic, which fits in quite well with the picture of the social covenant and the kind of society that could live the life of a social covenant on the basis of the baptismal life that I described earlier in the book.
And I actually found a page yesterday that was to do with Tolkien because I just absolutely loved it. So I thought I'd actually just read it out because it was so well put. You said, "We continue to need mythopoesis, the creation of secondary worlds that will throw light on a primary world, now known to be not only a divinely created cosmos, but one predestined to be summed up in Jesus Christ." And then you refer to the Lord of the Rings, the ordered thaumaturgic field of play that is the Lord of the Rings may be potent enough to open up the true dimensions of a God-related, God-dependent cosmos with an implicit Christological ethos, thanks to the importance thereof, humility and little things, as well as to the theme of unexpected triumph through suffering endured. And I just thought that was a really extraordinary expression of what Tolkien is about. And I wanted to ask you about this order. You said an ordered thaumaturgic field of play. What did you mean by that?
Goodness me, I can't imagine.
Well, it's wonder-working, isn't it?
Yes,
Wonder-working.
That's right. Well, of course, there is, there are, in comparison with ordinary human powers, there are powers at work in The Lord of the Rings, both for evil and for good, that are preternatural. So whether you're thinking of the Dark Lord and the forging of the rings, or the orcs, the orcs I suppose wouldn't be preternatural, but but anyway, for the powers of good, the elves, obviously it has to be an example of a secondary sub-created world, because these things don't correspond to any species known to biology or any great individuals known to history. But the point is that the way in which the struggle between powers of good and evil in that sub-created world, where the preternatural, by our standards, is the natural, the way in which that struggle between good and evil is worked out in The Lord of the Rings is a very good example of what, in his essay on fairy stories, he calls catastrophe, which then is the intuition that perspective in world history is a turning point which is for the good and which will be towards the good, and this is a sort of, you might say, generally pagan anticipation of or subsequent memory of the coming of the gospel. I think there is something in the view that human culture at large not only has a faint memory of a golden age in the past, but has a pre-intuition of a precognition of a golden age in the future, because on the one hand, people find it very easy to evaluate the world around them in the light of a criterion which they have not actually, a criterion of perfection, which they've not actually inferred from the world around them, but which is, as it were, an a priori rule that they bring to bear upon it, which could be explained in terms of an Edenic memory, a memory of a golden age. And at the same time, people also have a very visceral hope for the transformation of ill situations, which could be regarded as a sort of, say, precognition of a golden future ahead rather than a golden past behind us. There's a form of greeting which grew up among, I think, the white working class in England. My impression is it's only within the last 30 years or so, whereby when you greet people, you say, "All right." I discovered when I lived in Cumbria 2 years ago that there the version is "you all right," but I prefer the "all right" one because my theory is that this is what has been called by an American sociologist a rumor of angels, and it's about the future condition of the cosmos. So this is why I prefer "all right" to "you all right." "You all right" is too individualized, personalized. "All right" is universal. And so my theory is that it is it's a post-Christian hangover of a Christian conviction which is best summed up by Julian of Norwich in her Revelations of Divine Love, that all shall be well and all manner of things shall be well. Now, this theory of mine has been blown out of the water, you might say, potentially, by a sociologist who told me that nonsense, or maybe a psychologist told me nonsense, it's a distancing mechanism. So it's a way of disinviting you from making any more generous conversational overture. So
I see, yeah.
It cuts conversation short. But I think that myself is rather cynical, both about the individual human beings who tend to exchange this greeting, all right? And also about my general theory about that there are such things as rumors of angels. There are signals of transcendence that break through even in the most deeply dark empirical order of things.
Maybe to sum up, perhaps when the angel Gabriel came at the Annunciation, he started with, "You all right?"
Pass on that
one. So I just wanted to thank you so much today for coming and joining us to talk about the conversion of England. And you taught us so much about it being an act of memory, but also an act of looking forward to the future. So I do really want to thank you for joining us today. And I wanted to ask you a final question, if I could. What do you think that St. Dominic or St. Thomas Aquinas would make of your book, An Unfashionable Essay on the Conversion of England?
Well, I think, St. Dominic would surely have to, if he was at all consistent with his charism, he would surely have to be in favor of evangelization. He lived in a world that was, for the most part in Europe, prior to the emergence of nation states in their complete identity. But on the other hand, he was very keen on kings because he had a royal mission to carry out from Castile to Denmark. So he wouldn't, I think, have jibbed at my royalism. St. Thomas is famous as a theologian who is very keen to modulate or moderate the relations between nature and grace. That's one of the things that I try to do in the book, because it is about how a pagan world is brought into Christendom in a way that ought to endure if people know what's good for them, and that within that scenario there are many dimensions to human life, which all of which need to be brought within the converting power of the gospel, and that would answer to another feature of Thomas and the school of Thomas, or the Thomist tradition, which is a desire to do justice to all the various rationes, the various aspects under which reality can be explored and celebrated.
Thank you so much, Father Aidan, for joining us today. Enjoy your stay in Walsingham.
Thank you.